Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the current phase of fighting in Gaza will end very soon, freeing up troops to send to the northern border to confront Hezbollah. China and the EU agree to hold talks on the bloc's plan to impose tariffs on electric vehicle imports. Plus, as the UK counts down to the general election on July the 4th, Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix moderates a live election debate. Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch and Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds go head-to-head at 3:30 p.m. Dubai time. What's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates? I'm Giovanna Bersace over here in Dubai. A lot to get through on the show today. No least, we're going to talk about the geopolitical developments over the weekend here in the Middle East. But as ever, let's kick off the show taking a look back at how some of these key equity markets performed towards the close. And you can see behind me that the S&P did slightly dip towards the end of the day. These are the futures actually pointing towards a further dip. But by the close on Friday, we did see the S&P close below 5,500. So it's been quite difficult for that U.S. equity index to keep moving higher. 5,500 does appear to be somewhat of a resistance, despite the fact that we had better than expected PMI numbers come through on Friday, the best numbers since June 2023. That gave a bit of life, or breathed a little bit of life into yields once more, which turned around from some of the strength that we saw in the prior days. Looking ahead, we've got Asia Pacific as well. Well, the handover also negative from the Asian session. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But as you can see, not a pretty start to the week there, down 0.5%. The big focus for investors, not just, of course, in Asia, but across the world, is going to be that PCE print out of the U.S. this Friday. That is Fed's, of course, preferred inflation metric. So will be a big signal for investors looking ahead. Dollar yen also squarely in focus again, inching back to 160. As we've spoken about in prior sessions, that is typically the level where you would expect to see some form of intervention. And indeed, the Vice Finance Minister Kanda was on the tapes this morning saying or suggesting that they could intervene 24 hours a day if needed. And again, these comments are very much in focus given all of the price action we're seeing in the yen. And then the pound, of course, a lot of focus on that into the UK elections. One chart I want to draw your attention to is cross-asset performance. And I thought this was quite interesting because, as you can see from the bars here, global stocks have now been posted positive gains for 3 quarters in a row, but bonds keep on falling. That is those white bars in the charts here. So it tells you that if you were invested in equities, you would have done well for the last couple of quarters. Not the case for bonds. But of course, things are beginning to turn around now as we talk about the prospects of rate cuts into the end of the year. But still significant to note that equity investors will have outperformed bond investors at this point. All right, let's check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio. The handover not so pretty today from Asia. Avril.
Not pretty at all, Giovanna. I mean, we're seeing it risk off in the region, although the Japanese benchmark is the outlier. And this is against the backdrop of weak Japanese currency that's supporting the automaking related stocks. But elsewhere in the region, it is the infotech sector, it's the chip stocks that are among the big drags. We're also seeing declines on the mainland. And earlier today, the Shanghai Comp actually touched its lowest level since February as investors kind of demand more in the way of stimulus measures for the economy. Let's flip the board and take a closer look at what we're seeing in the yen, because as you just talked about, we did get verbal intervention from the currency chief, but also the finance minister, neither of which seems to be helping to support the Japanese yen that much, as we see it hovering at levels that breach already what we saw earlier in the year, those levels that were thought to have actually prompted intervention. One of the things that investors might be keeping in mind is how the last time Japan intervened late April, early May was actually really, really expensive. So this time around for the finance ministry, they might be waiting for dollar yen to actually reach the fresh highs for the cycle before they step in and respond. Giovanna.
Yen intervention, indeed, that is the big question for investors, and how long it's going to take for Bank of Japan to get involved to bring the currency back under check again. Avril Hong in Singapore. Now, to the latest in the Middle East, where the Israeli Prime Minister says the intense stage of fighting in Gaza will end very soon. In his first interview with an Israeli media outlet since the October 7th Hamas attacks, Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel's military will redeploy some forces to the north, where exchanges with Lebanon's Hezbollah have been escalating. The Prime Minister also directly rejected, for the first time, the prospect of a ceasefire deal with Hamas. So lots to talk about. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Honor Ant, who joins us from Istanbul. Just give us the latest. I thought it was, first of all, interesting that the Prime Minister finally gave an interview to an Israeli channel. So far, it's been the realm of international media. So that's important to note. But what did he say, Honor?
As you said, Jumana, it's quite a curious choice for him to wait for 9 months to give an interview to a national media outlet. That's a lot about the interview itself. And I think the highlights of the interview does a great job in explaining possible reasoning behind that. As you said, the main highlight of the interview that Netanyahu gave yesterday was the fact that he said major operations in Gaza will come to end very soon. Now, to put things into context, he was answering a question, direct question about whether or not the fighting would come to an end in a month, which is something that a question that Israeli public has been busy discussing some time now. And his response seemed to be, in a way, non-committal, maybe, but didn't go too far off from that mark either. He said, very soon it will be over. Another highlight of the interview, as you said, was the fact that he, for the first time, rejected the kind of ceasefire deal backed by the U.S. that would bring the Gaza fighting to a complete end. But if the major operations will end in a month or so, frankly, that question probably isn't that interesting anymore. But we can come back to that later and talk about what this might mean in terms of the rift between the U.S. and Israel. But yeah, the main highlight was the fact that he talked about major operations and whether or not they will come to an end very soon. And has a lot of implications for the wider Middle East, because the end of major operations will obviously mean more resources being allocated to the north of the country, to the border with Syria, where Hezbollah and Israel have been engaged in deadly skirmishes since the war began.
Honor, I do want to pick up on those comments because it is very significant. And the fact that he said that the next step for the military would be for Israel to redeploy some forces to the north, where, as we know, tensions have been increasing with Hezbollah. What are the latest developments over there from the weekend?
So let's go through this step by step. As you said, what does the new phase in the Gaza war might mean? That means withdrawal of some Israeli forces, paving the way to special operations into Gaza and out, which might be good news for Gaza on its own. It would definitely result in more resources being allocated to the north, to the border with Syria, to the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah is located. And that will definitely result in increasing likelihood of a full-blown war with the Iran-backed militant group, which will most likely be more deadly and possibly prolonged and wider in scope than anything else we have seen so far. And why is that so important for the wider region? Unlike Hamas, Hezbollah is in fact a militant group that is, unlike any other group in the region, has tens of thousands of fighters, has hundreds of thousands of missiles and rockets in its arsenal, believed to be so. And just over the past 5 days, both Hezbollah and other Iran-backed groups in the region have said openly that tens, if not tens of thousands of members of different militia backed by Iran in the region would join Hezbollah in the event of an open war between Israel and Hezbollah, which would increase the stakes dramatically in case of such a war.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we are entering into a very crucial week in terms of what happens on that border. Honor, thank you for the latest. That was Honor Ant, who runs the Middle East newsroom out of Istanbul. All right, elsewhere in the region, Iran is holding a snap presidential election later this week following the death of Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. Now, voters will choose from 6 men, most of them anti-U.S. hardliners, with the former Tehran mayor leading a poll of polls published earlier this month by Iran's state broadcaster. Let's bring in Golnar Moghvali, head of Iran coverage for Bloomberg News. So, big week coming up, obviously the presidential elections towards the end of this week. We've got 6 candidates. All of them appear to be pretty hardliners.
Yeah, that's right, Jumana. We have, obviously, as you said in your introduction, six 6 men, as usual, in this race. And we have one token reformist candidate, though, among what is mostly a slate of conservative and hardline politicians. And that one reformist, whose name is Masoud Pezeshkian, he actually, there is a lot of talk and speculation at the moment that he may actually have a decent chance on the election, on the actual day of the election, which will be on Friday. And that's because he actually has a lot of kind of political chops, if you like. He's a very experienced politician. He was health minister under the previous reformist government of Mohammad Khatami back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And he's a well-known name. He's not someone who doesn't have very much support or who's a moderate and a reformist by default, if you like, which is kind of the case we had in 2021 when Ebrahim Raisi was able to win with a landslide on an extremely low turnout. So in this case, we're looking at the possibility of a much higher turnout compared to last time, potentially, maybe. There are big question marks over this because of the recent levels of unrest and dissent in Iran over recent years have been very high. As we know, in 2022, we had these massive protests after the death of Mahsa Amini. This means that there's a lot of disenfranchisement, disenchantment in the country. There has been for many years. And so there are always going to be question marks over whether a single candidate can boost turnout, whether they're going to invigorate the electorate enough to actually get people to come to the ballot box.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Pezeshkian because he is being posited as the more moderate or at least less conservative of the 6 candidates running for president. And yet at the same time, if you listen to the rhetoric that's come out of the debates, he's very much emphasizing economic policy continuity versus his predecessor. And even when it comes to cultural issues, I thought it was interesting that in the most recent debate, he also threw his weight behind the support for the mandatory hijab for women. So he isn't perhaps reformist in the sense that, or in the way that the Western eyes would perceive him to be.
Yeah, that's very true in many ways. That's a very good point. That last debate that you just referenced there, they did talk about Iran's laws on mandatory hijab, which are broadly very unpopular, and I would say deeply, deeply unpopular in certain parts of the country, particularly if you look at the capital city, Tehran, and other urban centers like Mashhad in the northeast. And he did say that he would support mandatory hijab. One of the major pillars of the Islamic Republic as a political regime and a political system in Iran is actually mandatory hijab for women. In some ways, therefore, it would be very difficult for any of the candidates to express any strong opposition or any plans to actually remove that law or to change it. What he did say was that he wasn't in favor of the very tough crackdowns, the very violent and aggressive crackdowns we've seen against women displayed by the police. He said that he was opposed to that and that he would like to see he thought that was counterproductive. That's not something that's new. Other politicians have said that in the past. But you're right. On that issue does seem to be a red line. And that, for many people, might actually, that is for many people a reason for them not to vote. This disenchantment generally with the system as a whole and this idea that we're not going to change things fundamentally.
Yeah. I think that turnout point is going to be key as to who eventually is going to end up winning when those elections take place towards the end of the week. Golnar, thank you so much. And also, I realize you're in London, so thank you for the early wake up as well. Golnar Mativali, head of Iran coverage at Bloomberg News. Now, Saudi authorities say more than 1,300 people have died during this year's Hajj pilgrimage as the kingdom faces extreme high temperatures. The Saudi health minister says most of the victims were what he called unauthorized pilgrims who walked long distances in the heat to perform the Hajj rituals. Almost 700 of the dead are from Egypt. Now, speaking on state-owned TV, the minister said another 95 people were being treated in hospitals. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Now, let's turn to the U.S. and the question of how long rates will stay elevated. Markets are pricing in a much higher neutral rate than policymakers are currently projecting. 5-year forwards have stalled at 3.6%, which is a full percentage point higher than the average over the past decade and above the Fed's own estimate of 2.75%. So interesting context. Let's bring in Rashmi Garg, Senior Portfolio Manager at Dhabi Capital, joining me now in the studio. Good to have you here. I know you traveled all the way from Abu Dhabi to be here. Maybe let's just start out with the immediate data that's to come this week. We've got PCE coming on Friday, and if you look at the most recent batches of inflation prints that have hit, they have actually surprised to the downside. They're coming in lower than what people had been anticipating. So how does that, cement the case for rate cuts in the second half of this year?
Yes, so I think you're right, Jumana. I mean, inflation has been benign. At least the last two prints have been benign. And what we've been seeing is that we are seeing an easing in goods inflation while the services part of it is still sticky. Now, with the PCE data that is due this Friday, I think it will continue the trend. We will continue to see flattish trend in PCE, and we expect it to be fairly benign, which makes a stronger case for a Fed rate cut. Now, when exactly this will happen is still a question mark for us. And the reason for that is that we do not have a very definitive direction from all the data. And Fed, as it always says, they look at the totality of the data rather than one data point. Inflation, of course, we know PCE gauge is the most important gauge that they look at.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they also need to look at other economic data as well. And we saw that industrial production was very strong. We saw the PMI data, especially the services side of that, was strong, while we saw slight cooling down in the labor market. We saw retail sales a bit weaker, and we saw housing starts being a bit weaker as well. So there is a mix of data here. There is no definitive direction which is pointing to the fact that, yes, a rate cut should be the next right move for the Fed. But, yes, it makes the case stronger. And we need a few more data points where after which Fed can definitely say that, yes, we are looking at a rate cut.
And still soft landing scenario. It wasn't that long ago that everyone's talking about the potential of a hard landing recession, but all of that's been completely blown out the window. What do you make of this market pricing and the fact that these 5-year forwards are expecting a much higher terminal interest rate than what the Fed themselves are guiding to? What sort of implications will that have on financial assets?
So I think in general, we need to be mentally prepared for a higher for longer interest rate scenario. Now, of course, like you mentioned, the Fed projections have the neutral rate at about 2.75%, while in general, the market is projecting it to be at 3.7, 3.8%. Now, this is something that can be a topic for debate. The neutral rate is not something that can be decided over a short period of time. It is something that requires a longer period of time to come at a right estimate. And even then, it is not something which is so easily estimated. Given by the way economic trends have been, the economy has been fairly strong despite higher interest rate, 525 bips of rate hikes, and yet the economy performs. No talk of, like you said, hard landing, soft landing being the key scenario. So clearly, there has been something in the economy which has kept its strength. Maybe the interest rate endurance has been higher, or maybe it is also the fiscal spending, which wasn't accompanied, last time when we saw this kind of rate hikes, we did not have as strong fiscal spending. So there are a lot of factors to consider. But yeah, as of now, definitely this is a topic for debate.
Yeah. I see in your research that you still like owning U.S. equities. Let me phrase the question as a question of how you think the U.S. will perform versus their European equities counterparts. Because what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is a lot of political premium is being priced into European equities. They have started to really underperform versus the U.S. after a good start to the year. Does that change once the French elections are out of the way, do you think, and then people start focusing on U.S. elections? Or is that premium in the U.S. just going to stay?
So I think, the outperformance of U.S. equities year to date as compared to European equities, I think the reason for that has been some very strong underlying trends, underlying themes which have really propelled these equities. We all know about AI and the hype around that, but we do believe it is a real trend there. Now in Europe, there has been substantial reason, actually around maybe 15, 20 days ago, maybe a month ago, the narrative was forming that, yes, finally the European equity should start outperforming and US has a bit of froth now. But then we saw the debacle that happened in France, and we saw that, the entire sort of, snap election scenario kind of muddied the picture for Europe. And that has been the issue with Europe. There's always something or the other which, in a way, muddies the picture and makes the path forward a bit less clear. Yes, French equities and in general European equities have underperformed going into this, and we do think there will be some opportunities once the elections are out of the way. But as an overall geography, we are selective in Europe because we feel that there are certain sectors which will do well, but as a whole, Europe will still underperform the US.
Yeah. All right, good place to leave it. Rashmi, thank you so much for joining me today on the show. Rashmi Garg, Senior Portfolio Manager at Dhabi Capital. And also coming up, China and the EU agreed to hold talks on the bloc's plan to impose tariffs on electric vehicle imports. We have the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersachi in Dubai. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following this morning. Apple will be withholding a range of new technologies from hundreds of millions of consumers in the European Union. The company announced on Friday it will block the release of Apple Intelligence, iPhone mirroring, and SharePlay screen sharing from users in the EU when the services are released later this year. It says the bloc's regulatory attempts to rein in big tech force it to downgrade security and place user privacy and data at risk. The U.S. Mid-Atlantic region is struggling under an extended heat wave, with temperatures soaring from New York to Washington. New York's Central Park touched 33 degrees Celsius, while temperatures at Reagan National Airport outside Washington tied a record set in 1988. And more extreme weather may be on the way, with forecasts for severe thunderstorms and possible tornadoes. And U.S. prosecutors have recommended to senior Justice Department officials that Boeing face criminal charges for violating a settlement related to 2 fatal crashes. That's according to Reuters, citing 2 people familiar with the matter. The criminal charges DOJ officials are considering were not specified and could extend beyond the original 2021 fraud conspiracy charge. And coming up, we discuss what to expect from the upcoming Iranian election. This is Bloomberg. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the current phase of fighting in Gaza will end very soon, freeing up troops to send to the northern border to confront Hezbollah. China and the EU agreed to hold talks on the bloc's plan to impose tariffs on electric vehicle imports. Plus, as the UK counts down to the general election on July the 4th, Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix moderates a live election debate. Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch and Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds go head-to-head at 3:30 p.m. Dubai time. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jemana Bersachi in Dubai. A quick check at how some of these markets have fared. As somewhat of a negative close for S&P towards the close on Friday, despite stronger than expected PMI numbers, the best we've seen since June 2023. Looking ahead today, you can see that the futures are also pointing towards a negative open to the tune of about 0.1%. Of course, investors eyeing up that PCE print that comes up later this week. The handover from Asia was pretty negative as well. Asia Pacific stocks down about 0.4% as we get into the European session. Dollar yen in focus sitting just shy of 160, very close to intervention level, and then the pound through 127 to the downside. And of course, investors still digesting that Bank of England meeting last week. Some people were calling it a dovish hold. But again, the signpost ahead is going to be the elections taking place on July 4th. And here's a quick look at one of the terminal charts that we have this morning. I thought it would be nice to take a look back across asset performance over the last few quarters. No surprise here. Global stocks up for the 3rd straight quarter. Bonds, however, keep on falling. So we have seen an outperformance of how equities have done versus their fixed income equivalents. Now, let's check in also on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril is in our Singapore studio. And Avril, what are you watching for apart from dollar yen, of course?
Yeah, we're watching how that is actually playing out in equities. But let me unpack a bit further what you spoke of on how we are approaching those intervention levels on dollar yen. Earlier in the session, we saw it almost towards that 160 level. And this is coming against the backdrop of stronger than expected US PMIs, some demand for the greenback amid the political uncertainty in Europe, and also as we keep an eye out for the PCE numbers from the US later in the week. And then think about the other side of the equation on the yen for the BOJ and how officials have been pretty reluctant to, give details on how it's going to reduce its bond purchases. So the yield differentials, all things considered, is likely to remain wide. And that's why, despite those verbal intervention rounds that you got from the top currency chief and the finance minister today, it's not really helped to bring that rebound on the yen that much. But let's flip the board, take a look at how that's playing out in the equities, as the automaking related stocks are the ones that are getting a boost from the cheap Japanese currency, but the chip making related ones, they are tracking those declines that we saw on Nvidia late last week. Jumana.
Thank you so much, Avril in Singapore. Now, moving on to another big story. China and the European Union have agreed to discuss the bloc's plans to impose additional tariffs on EV imports next month, taking taxes to as much as 48%. Our China correspondent Min Min Lo is in Hong Kong with the details. Min Min, I thought it was interesting to note that German ministers landed in Beijing on Friday for a 3-day visit. Has anything come out of the visit so far?
Yeah, obviously one of the biggest news that has come out over the weekend is that China and EU have now agreed to those talks on tariffs on Chinese EVs, and Germany likely had a hand in that. The German ministers were in China over the weekend when we heard that the German Vice Chancellor saying, repeatedly really emphasizing that these tariffs, that there is room for maneuver, that he hoped both sides would take advantage of that room and to avoid an escalatory tariff war. China has been Germany has been one of the strongest critics of those tariffs. And we see also the German Vice Chancellor trying to manage expectations as well. He said during his trip that it's impossible for this conflict to be resolved while he's in China because he also cannot negotiate on behalf of the EU. And also one thing to note, the German Vice Chancellor, he didn't get to meet with Chinese Premier Li Qiang, the number 2 man in China who is of equivalent rank to him. So that is a little bit disappointing. Robert Habeck himself saying that he doesn't know why that didn't work out, although he got to meet with other Chinese officials, including the Commerce Minister, as well as the head of the NDRC, which is China's macroeconomic planner, where they had some discussions and agreements around energy cooperation. But again, when it comes to those tariffs, that's where the biggest sticking points are.
I mean, I guess, to tie that into what happens next, what does a trade deal look like if they don't end up applying the tariffs? Clearly, there is an inclination from the European side to put up some barriers. So do we have any idea for what the ultimate resolution might look like after these talks conclude?
Yes, so the Chinese state-linked media Global Times have expressed that China's biggest hope is really for Europe to lift all those tariffs before July 4th, when the provisional tariffs will kick in. But we're just 1.5 weeks away from that, so that's not very realistic given the time frame. And perhaps a more realistic time frame would be the second deadline in November, when the final tariffs will be decided. Now, the Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao had talks with his European Union counterpart on Saturday over video conference call. The European Commission spokesperson said that the talk was candid and constructive, that he expects there to be more talks at all levels in the coming weeks, but any expected outcome must address what he calls these injurious subsidies. Now, some analysts say that perhaps it's not just about lowering these tariffs, but it's about maybe getting some Chinese companies to invest in Europe, to pay European wages to European workers, and that could perhaps lessen some of that cost advantage as well as the threat of taking jobs away from European workers.
Very interesting. And very interesting to note that these negotiations are still ongoing behind the scenes. Our China correspondent, Min Min Lo. Now, back to one of our top stories today. We are looking ahead to Iran's elections, which come at a time of heightened domestic discontent and voter apathy. 6 out of the 80 registered candidates have been approved to run. And despite the fact that a reformist has been allowed to compete, well, debatable whether he's a reformist the way the Westerners would interpret him to be, hardliners are widely expected to garner the majority of votes. Now, Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi is a senior analyst at Control Risk Middle East and joins us now from Abu Dhabi. Well, let's just start with the Iranian elections towards the end of this week. What are you expecting in terms of who ends up winning it and what that means for policy and policy continuity out of the elections?
First of all, thanks for having me and good morning. Well, I think what is interesting is that the race is very much open. When we see the polls, we see that the main candidates, 3 out of 6, have each between 18 to 20% of the voting preference at the moment. And we are talking about the current Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, the reformist figure, as you mentioned, Pezeshkian, and the other one being Jalili, who was the former chief nuclear negotiator during the Ahmadinejad period. These are the 3 candidates who seem to be battling, but I think the race is still very much open, and part of it has to do with the fact that not many people have still decided whether to even participate in the elections or not. I think the polls estimate a turnout around 45 to 48%, and I think there is still a lot of undecided people. Part of it has to do with, as you say, discontent and apathy towards political developments in Iran. Part of it is also related to the selection of candidates, which, as discussed, is mainly among conservatives. 5 of them are hardliner conservatives, and only one arguably can be considered as a reformist moderate, but not even someone who was popular among the reformists themselves before it was selected to run in these elections. So I think it's still very, very unclear whether a winner will come out of these elections on Friday, or whether a second round will actually be necessary to see who is going to be the next president.
Interesting. And in terms of policy implications, even Pezeshkian has said that he plans to continue with the economic path put forward by his predecessor, President Raisi. But then, when President Raisi was killed, one of the conversations we had at the time is that ultimately it is still going to be the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, who sets the ideological agenda for Iran, who's responsible for foreign affairs decisions, defense decisions. And so really, how much is this new president going to impact Iran's relationship with the rest of the world and also domestic policies?
I think it's a very important question. And I think, as you say, the supreme leader ultimately has the ultimate say, especially on all security foreign policy matters. What we have seen, however, over the past is that the president do matter, not so much in the terms of the red lines. These are decided by the supreme leader and are not going to be changed by whoever is going to be the next president. But in terms of tactical approach, they can actually have an impact. So we have seen actually significant differences between someone like Khatami, Rouhani, compared to someone like Ahmadinejad or even Raisi, who preferred, for instance, to deal with the East, particularly Russia and China, had a very, very strong agenda on strengthening relationship with the members of the BRICS, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, compared to someone like Rouhani, who was in charge just before Raisi and had a much more open agenda towards the West. He didn't necessarily succeed in promoting the whole agenda, besides, for instance, the agreement on the nuclear issue, which was reached in 2015. But the overall agenda was to actually have engagement, have dialogue, and have that as a key to solve the issues of the country. So someone like Pezeshkian is likely to lean towards that kind of agenda, lean towards stronger engagement with the West compared to what we have seen over the past 3 years under Raisi, with, of course, continuity in terms of foreign policy, especially when it comes to the region and the support to the proxies or support to countries that have been considered as allies in the region.
Right. Aniseh, thank you so much. Going to have to leave it there. Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, Senior Analyst at Control Risk Middle East. Now, voters in the UK head to the polls in less than 2 weeks' time as campaigning in the general election enters its final stretch. The next government is set to face an 18-month worsening of the misery index as rising joblessness outweighs slowing inflation. Let's bring in our UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden, who joins me from London. Lizzie, I didn't even know that there was such a thing as a misery index. But good to know that people are monitoring its developments very closely in the UK. I've got to say, though, we were speaking about a week ago about how the fact that these inflation numbers continue to surprise to the downside. At least headline inflation is now back at 2%. Why aren't the broader public happier with the state of affairs?
Well, Jemana, they actually are pretty happy now compared to where they were previously. So if you look back at the misery index, it's averaged about 11 since Rishi Sunak came in to power. It's been about 11, and now it's 6 when you've got inflation, as you say, back at the Bank of England's 2% target. But the worrying thing for whoever is the next Prime Minister, and the polls suggest it's going to be Labour's Keir Starmer, is the expectation that the misery index over the next 18 months is going to average 7.5. Why? Well, if we just think about what the misery index actually is, as you say, it's a combination of unemployment and inflation. And the expectation is that because of strong underlying wage growth, actually having a job is going to become the main pain point. And we've at Bloomberg interviewed the CEO of Currys, the high street retailer, of course, and its CEO has warned about if there is another rise in the national minimum wage, the government really needs to think about whether that will become prohibitively expensive for businesses to employ people. We've also had the Bank of England's Megan Green warning about a rise in unemployment. So it could be a difficult inheritance for the next government.
And I know child poverty is also high on the agenda as well. But look, let's turn to today. Bloomberg is hosting a debate between the Business and Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, and the man polls say will replace her, that is Labour's Jonathan Reynolds. What are you watching out for in that debate?
Well, it's a really important moment, Jemana, because in the political consensus in the UK, what both major parties agree on is that economic growth really needs to be prioritised. And of course, business is going to be key to that. And this is the only opportunity where business will be the focus of an election debate. We're going to take questions from the big 5 business lobby groups. And it's an opportunity to find out the major differences between Labour and the Conservatives. I would say as well that Kemi Badenoch and Jonathan Reynolds are two interesting figures in their own right. They're both born in 1980. They both became MPs relatively young. They've had meteoric rises through the parties, and they're both tipped as potential leaders. Kemi Badenoch indeed ran in 2022. So when it comes to this debate, things that I'm going to be looking out for are what are their strategies to grow the economy? What is that in the long term, when it comes to AI and industrial strategy, not a very sexy word in this election debate. How do you fix the skills shortage unless you pump serious money into education and migration if you're going to allow more visas? What about Brexit? It's really been the elephant in the room of this campaign. And finally, what about investment into, for example, the green economy? Does it matter where it comes from, whether it comes from China or where you are, Jemana, the Middle East?
Exciting stuff. Lizzie, thank you for waking up early and giving us an overview of what to expect. And coming up just before that debate, Philip Hammond, the former UK Chancellor, will join the Pulse. That interview is at 9 a.m. in London. And on our show right now, we're going to be talking about Dubai's red-hot real estate market, which is showing resilience. We'll tell you why one of the hottest property markets in the world could be breaking free from its boom and bust cycles. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Now, Dubai's red-hot real estate market is defying predictions of a slowdown in a sign that the Middle Eastern business hub could be breaking free from its boom and bust cycles. Many analysts had previously expected the surge in property prices and rents to ease by early 2024, but those predictions have not materialized. Prices in the city surged 60% since the end of 2020, while rents have soared a whopping 83% since 2020. So for more on this, Bloomberg's Middle East real estate reporter Zainab Fattah joins me now. Great to have you with us on the show. I really enjoyed reading the article of the weekend, not least because I realize over here it's a national pastime to talk about Dubai house prices. But your article suggests that this period of boom and bust may be coming to an end. Why?
Yeah, towards the end of last year, we saw a lot of people expecting, because of the tensions geopolitically across the Middle East, because prices rose up so quickly, and because the expectations that Russian money coming in would dwindle, that you're going to see the market go flat this year and possibly decline a little bit. This hasn't materialized, of course, and a lot of people are kind of thinking about what could the future hold. Can we keep going up at this rate? The expectations of a lot of analysts that this year we're not going to see decline in prices because transaction activity is still very strong. And there are a lot of people still coming to buy in Dubai. And when I ask brokers, who's buying? They say, well, everyone. So you have a lot of Europeans, people from India and Pakistan, and even as far as the US and Canada, you're seeing a lot of demand coming into the market.
But, you drive around the city and you see construction everywhere. Everywhere there seems to be cranes, buildings, new supply coming to the market. At what point does that start getting factored in? The fact that you have so much supply about to hit.
And this is the crux of the matter, Jumana. So basically, the expectations of a lot of analysts in the market that once a lot of the supply hits the market and is completed, is definitely going to have some downward pressure on prices and rents. Now, the government also has an interest in ensuring the city doesn't become too expensive for companies relocating staff here and for families that want to stay here. So last year, we had about 40,000 homes delivered across Dubai, and those were absorbed quickly. The delivery of homes that happened this year also been absorbed quite quickly without seeing much pressure on prices. The expectation is that between 2025 and 2027, you are going to start to see bigger number of supply coming in. Some analysts are putting the number as around 240,000. But again, how many of those units are going to materialize, that depends on construction speed and so on. But even if half of that materialize, that should help the market a little bit and ease the strain.
Yeah, and then of course the other factor to think about is just the sheer population growth, and that continues to rise. Zainab, thank you so much. The full story is up on the terminal. Bloomberg's Middle East reporter Zainab Fattah. Now, also coming up, Prosus is reporting earnings today. We have more on what to expect from Europe's largest consumer internet company. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. Now, Europe's largest consumer internet company is reporting earnings today. Prosus has seen an improvement in its valuation in recent months, despite concerns about its exposure to Tencent amid Beijing's tighter regulations of Chinese gaming companies. Now, with a new CEO at the helm, investors will keep a close eye on the discount between Prosus and its South African parent, Naspers. So for more, Bloomberg's Ondiro Ganga joins me live from Kigali. So just tell us more about what to expect from these announcements.
Jumana, as you rightfully said, we're expecting that they will announce profits, particularly in their e-commerce business. And this is great news because the business has recorded some losses before, and a lot of investment and time goes into e-commerce before they're ready to get off the ground and become profitable businesses. So recording a profit will be a breath of fresh air. And if not, what are they going to tell their investors? So a positive and positive case for e-commerce and positive delivery is a great case for investment and also great for investor perception of the e-commerce portfolio. According to JP Morgan, they're expecting an end to EBITDA losses and revenue to go up by 34%. And this is attributed to a couple of things, one of them being food delivery, because they're seeing a growth in trading momentum, particularly with iFoods in Brazil. And they're also seeing resilient trading with OLX, and they can also attribute this to the plans that they have heard and executed on cutting back on cost. Moving forward, again, JP Morgan is saying they're expecting that the company or the business will be cutting back on areas that are not non-core growth and also areas that are draining their expenses.
Well, it sounds like the new CEO has his work cut out for him. Bloomberg's Ondiro Ganga, thank you so much for that report into Prosus earnings. All right, let's before we wrap up for the day, let's take a quick look at how equity futures are opening up. And it is a sea of red, I mean, marginally so, with moderate losses on the board. S&P futures seen about 0.1% weaker, Dow about 0.2%. And then as we head into the European session, looks like it's also going to be another weak session coming through as well. This keeping tab, of course, of the underperformance European equities have experienced versus their U.S. counterparts. But that is it for our show today. This was Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.